The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the dusty Durango, Colorado Mercantile, and Catherine Monroe stepped down into the September heat of 1878 with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to still them. 3 months had passed since she'd fled Kansas City with nothing but a carpetbag and the clothes on her back, and every town between there and here had taught her the same cruel lesson. A woman alone drew attention like blood in water draws sharks. She kept her eyes down as she walked toward the boarding house, a habit so ingrained now that she barely remembered what it felt like to meet another person's gaze. The proprietress, Mrs. Henshaw, had written that she needed help with the cooking and cleaning in exchange for room and board, and Catherine had replied immediately, grateful for any opportunity that might let her disappear into the kind of honest work that asked no questions. The boarding house stood 2 stories tall with peeling white paint and a sagging porch that had seen better decades. Catherine climbed the steps carefully, her movements small and precise, making herself as inconspicuous as possible. Before she could knock, the door swung open to reveal a round woman in her 50s with flour dusting her apron and skepticism etched into every line of her face. "You must be Miss Monroe," Mrs. Henshaw said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You are smaller than I expected. Can you lift a pot of stew?" "Yes, madam," Catherine said softly. "I am stronger than I look." Mrs. Henshaw studied her for a long moment, and Catherine felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to make herself smaller still, to become invisible if she could manage it. Finally, the older woman nodded and stepped aside. "Come in then. I will show you your room and the kitchen. Supper needs to be on the table by 6 o'clock sharp. I have 8 boarders currently, all men who work the mines or the ranches nearby. They pay good money and expect good food." Catherine followed her through the dim interior, past a parlor where 2 men sat smoking and reading newspapers. She felt their eyes on her and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the day was warm. One of them said something to the other in a low voice, and they both chuckled. Her stomach clenched, but she kept walking, kept her eyes on Mrs. Henshaw's broad back. The room she was given was barely larger than a closet, tucked up under the eaves on the 2nd floor, but it had a door that locked from the inside, and that was all Catherine cared about. She set her carpetbag on the narrow bed and stood for a moment, breathing in the musty smell of old wood and dust, letting herself feel the relief of 4 walls and a locked door. "You have 10 minutes," Mrs. Henshaw called from the hallway. "Then I need you in the kitchen." Catherine changed quickly into her oldest dress and tied an apron around her waist. Her reflection in the small mirror over the washstand showed a woman of 23 who looked older, with dark circles under her eyes and a tightness around her mouth that no amount of smiling could soften. Her auburn hair, once her vanity, was pulled back in a severe bun. She turned away from the mirror and headed downstairs. The kitchen was hot and chaotic, with pots boiling on the stove and bread rising under damp cloths. Mrs. Henshaw put her to work immediately, peeling potatoes while the older woman rolled out biscuit dough. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic thump of the rolling pin and the splash of potatoes dropping into water. "I do not allow any foolishness in my house," Mrs. Henshaw said suddenly. "The men who board here are decent enough, but they are still men. You keep to yourself, do your work, and there will be no trouble. You understand me?" "Yes, madam," Catherine said. "I prefer to keep to myself." Mrs. Henshaw glanced at her sideways. "I imagine you do. You have that look about you." Catherine's hands stilled for just a moment before she forced them to keep moving. "What look is that, madam?" "The look of someone running from something. I do not care what it is, mind you. Half the people in Durango are running from something. But whatever it is, do not bring it to my doorstep. I have worked too hard to build a respectable establishment to have it threatened by someone else's troubles." "I will not bring you any trouble," Catherine said quietly. "I just want to work and be left alone. Then we will get along fine." The boarders began filing in around 6 o'clock, their boots heavy on the floorboards, their voices loud after a day's work. Catherine kept to the kitchen, helping Mrs. Henshaw carry out platters of pot roast and bowls of potatoes, keeping her eyes down, moving quickly and efficiently. She could feel their stares, feel the weight of their attention, and her skin crawled with the familiar panic that she fought to suppress. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, reached out as she set down a basket of biscuits, his hand coming toward her arm. Catherine jerked back so violently that she nearly dropped the basket, her heart hammering in her chest. The man's eyes widened in surprise. "I was just going to ask for the butter," he said, holding up his hands. "I will get it," Catherine managed, her voice barely audible. She fled back to the kitchen, her breath coming in short gasps. Mrs. Henshaw looked at her sharply but said nothing, just handed her the butter dish and gave her a slight nod toward the dining room. Catherine forced herself to go back, forced herself to set the butter on the table and retreat once more. She could hear them talking in lower voices now, could imagine what they were saying about the strange, skittish woman who had appeared in their midst. For the next 3 weeks, Catherine fell into a routine that kept her as separate from the boarders as possible. She rose before dawn to start the breakfast preparations, served the meals quickly and efficiently, and spent the rest of her time cleaning rooms when the men were out working. She took her own meals in the kitchen, long after everyone else had finished, and retreated to her small room as soon as her work was done. The boarders learned quickly not to try to engage her in conversation, not to reach toward her or make any sudden movements in her direction. Most of them seemed puzzled by her behavior. A few seemed annoyed, but they left her alone, and that was all she wanted. The only exception was a man named Donovan Drake, though she did not learn his name for nearly 2 weeks. He was different from the others in ways that made her both more cautious and, strangely, slightly less afraid. He was a cowboy who worked for one of the big ranches outside town, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. He was probably 27 or 28, she guessed, with the kind of quiet competence that came from years of hard work and self-reliance. What made him different was the way he never stared at her, never tried to talk to her, never made any move in her direction at all. When she entered the room to serve meals, he would look up briefly, give her a small nod of acknowledgement, and then return his attention to his plate or his conversation with the other boarders. When she came near to set down a dish or refill his coffee, he would lean slightly away, giving her more space, his hands visible on the table where she could see them. It took her a while to realize that he was doing it deliberately, that he had noticed her fear and was making a conscious effort not to contribute to it. The realization made something in her chest ache with an emotion she could not quite name. She watched him sometimes, when she thought no one would notice, studying the way he moved with an easy grace that spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin. He was quiet compared to the other boarders, speaking only when he had something worth saying, and his voice when he did speak was low and measured. The other men seemed to respect him, deferring to his opinion on matters related to horses and cattle and the best routes through the mountain passes. One evening in late October, Catherine was clearing the supper dishes when one of the miners, a man named Garrett who had been drinking before he came to the table, grabbed her wrist as she reached for his plate. The contact was so unexpected, so sudden, that Catherine's mind went blank with terror. She dropped the plates she was holding, and they shattered on the floor. She tried to pull away, but Garrett held on, grinning up at her. "What is the matter, sweetheart? I am not going to hurt you. I just wanted to say that was the best meal I have had in weeks." Catherine could not breathe, could not think past the pressure of his fingers on her wrist. Her vision started to narrow, dark spots appearing at the edges. "Let her go." Donovan's voice cut through the fog in her mind, quiet but with an edge of steel that made Garrett's grin falter. "I was not doing anything," Garrett protested. "I was just giving her a compliment. I said let her go." Donovan had not raised his voice, but he had stood up, and there was something in his posture that made Garrett release Catherine's wrist and raise his hands in mock surrender. Catherine stumbled backward, her freed hand coming up to clutch at her throat. She could not look at any of them, could not bear the weight of their attention. She turned and fled to the kitchen, leaving the broken dishes scattered across the dining room floor. She stood at the sink, her whole body shaking, tears streaming down her face though she made no sound. She heard Mrs. Henshaw's voice in the dining room, sharp and scolding, heard the scrape of chairs and the heavy tread of boots. Then there was silence. After a few minutes, Mrs. Henshaw came into the kitchen. She did not say anything, just picked up a broom and dustpan and went back to clean up the broken dishes. When she returned, she set the pieces on the counter and looked at Catherine with something that might have been sympathy. "Garrett will not be staying here anymore," she said. "I told him to pack his things tonight. I do not tolerate that kind of behavior in my establishment." "I am sorry about the dishes," Catherine whispered. "The dishes do not matter. Are you all right?" Catherine nodded, though it was a lie. She was not all right. She had not been all right for a long time. "Go up to your room," Mrs. Henshaw said, not unkindly. "I will finish up down here tonight." Catherine fled gratefully, locking herself in her small room and curling up on the bed in the dark. She could still feel Garrett's fingers on her wrist, could still feel the panic that had seized her. But underneath that, buried deeper, was the memory of Donovan's voice, quiet and steady, making Garrett let her go. The next morning she forced herself to go downstairs at the usual time, dreading the knowing looks and the whispers. But when she entered the kitchen, Mrs. Henshaw was alone, mixing batter for pancakes. "The men have already gone," the older woman said without looking up. "I told them breakfast would be late this morning. I thought you might prefer it that way." "Thank you," Catherine said softly. They worked in silence for a while, falling into the familiar rhythm of breakfast preparation. Finally, Mrs. Henshaw spoke without turning around. "How long has it been since you could stand a man's touch without wanting to jump out of your skin?" Catherine's hands stilled. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do. I was married to a man like that once a long time ago. Took me years to stop flinching every time someone came near me. So I know the signs." Catherine said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "The man who intervened last night, Donovan Drake, he has been boarding here for almost 2 years now. He is a good man, steady and decent. Works for the Triple Creek Ranch about 10 miles north of town. He keeps to himself mostly, but I have never heard a bad word spoken about him." "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I saw the way you looked at him after he made Garrett let you go, like you could not quite believe what had happened. And I saw the way he looked at you when you ran out of the room. He wanted to follow you to make sure you were all right, but he knew better than to do that. He knows you are scared of him, of all men. But I think maybe you are a little less scared of him than the others, and I think he knows that too." Catherine did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But for the rest of the day, Mrs. Henshaw's words echoed in her mind. That evening, when the boarders returned for supper, Catherine noticed that Donovan's usual seat had changed. He had moved to the far end of the table, the seat farthest from where she would be moving back and forth from the kitchen. Another small gesture, another way of giving her space and distance. Something in her chest tightened again, that same aching feeling she could not quite name. Over the following weeks, as October gave way to November and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks visible from Durango's main street, Catherine found herself increasingly aware of Donovan's presence. Not in the fearful, panic-inducing way she was aware of the other men, but in a different way that she did not quite know how to categorize. She noticed small things about him. The way he always thanked her quietly when she refilled his coffee, his eyes still on his plate. The way he helped Mrs. Henshaw carry in firewood without being asked. The way he read books in the parlor in the evenings, real books with leather bindings, not just newspapers and dime novels like the other boarders. One particularly cold evening in mid-November, Catherine was coming down the stairs with an armload of linens when she lost her footing on the last step. She would have fallen hard if Donovan had not been coming through the front door at that exact moment. He caught her without thinking, his arms coming around her to steady her, and then immediately released her and stepped back so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. "I am sorry," he said quickly, his hands coming up in a gesture of peace. "I did not mean to grab you like that." "Are you all right?" Catherine stood frozen, her heart pounding, but not entirely from fear. For just a moment in those brief seconds when he had caught her, she had felt something other than panic at a man's touch. It had been too quick for fear to take hold, and what she had felt instead was safety, the secure knowledge that she would not hit the ground. The feeling lingered even now, confusing and unsettling. "I am fine," she managed. "Thank you. You kept me from falling." It was perhaps the longest sentence she had ever spoken directly to him, and his eyes widened slightly in surprise. They were remarkable eyes, she noticed, clear and blue and direct without being aggressive. He held her gaze for just a moment, and she did not look away, did not feel the need to make herself small and invisible. "You are welcome," he said softly. Then he stepped aside, giving her plenty of room to pass, and she continued on to the linen closet with her heart still beating too fast. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Catherine let herself think about Donovan Drake for the first time, not as a threat to be avoided but as a man, a person. She thought about his quiet courtesy, his careful respect for her boundaries, his patience in never pushing, never demanding her attention or acknowledgement. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the hallway, not with the hunger or possessiveness she had learned to fear, but with something gentler. Concern, maybe. Interest, but the careful kind that asked for nothing in return. The realization that she was thinking about him this way both thrilled and terrified her. After everything that had happened, after all the months of running and hiding, she had been certain she would never want a man's attention again. The fact that some small part of her seemed to want his attention felt like a betrayal of her own hard-won caution. But another part of her, a part that she had thought was dead, whispered that maybe, just maybe, not all men were like the one she had fled. Maybe some men were like Donovan Drake, who understood that a woman's trust was something to be earned slowly and carefully, not taken by force or assumed as a right. December arrived with heavy snows that turned Durango into a frozen landscape of white drifts and icicles hanging from every eave. The boarders came home earlier each evening, driven indoors by the bitter cold, and the house was fuller and noisier than it had been in the warmer months. Catherine found it harder to avoid them, harder to maintain the careful distance she had established. But Donovan continued to give her space, continued to be reliably, consistently careful around her. He never tried to corner her in conversation, never stood too close, never made any sudden movements in her direction. And slowly, incrementally, Catherine found that his presence no longer made her want to flee. She could serve him his meals without her hands shaking. She could be in the same room with him without constantly calculating the distance to the nearest exit. On Christmas Eve, Mrs. Henshaw announced that she was making a special supper and that all the boarders were expected to attend. Catherine helped her prepare a feast that seemed extravagant after the simple meals of the previous months. Roast chicken and ham, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, apple pie with cream. When everything was ready, Mrs. Henshaw surprised her by insisting that she join them at the table. "It is Christmas," the older woman said firmly. "You are not eating alone in the kitchen tonight. I already set a place for you." Catherine's first instinct was to refuse, to insist that she would be more comfortable in the kitchen, but something in Mrs. Henshaw's expression told her that this was not a request. Reluctantly, she untied her apron and followed her into the dining room. The place that had been set for her was, mercifully, at the far end of the table, with Mrs. Henshaw on one side and an empty chair on the other. But as the boarders filed in and took their seats, Donovan quietly moved to the empty chair beside her. He did not say anything, did not acknowledge her directly, but his presence there felt deliberate, like he was creating a buffer between her and the others. The meal was loud and cheerful, with the men telling stories and joking with each other. Catherine ate quietly, grateful that no one was paying particular attention to her. At one point, someone asked Donovan about the spring roundup plans for the Triple Creek Ranch, and he answered in his low, steady voice, explaining the logistics in a way that made even Catherine, who knew nothing about ranching, find it interesting. "You should come out and see it sometime," one of the other boarders said to Catherine, startling her. "The spring roundup is quite a sight. Hundreds of cattle, cowboys everywhere. It is chaos, but organized chaos." Catherine looked up, not sure how to respond. The man seemed to be making a genuine attempt at friendly conversation, but she could not think of anything to say that would not sound foolish or make him think she was encouraging his attention. "Miss Monroe might not find several hundred head of cattle and the dust they kick up all that appealing," Donovan said mildly, rescuing her. "It is not exactly a picnic." The other man laughed. "I suppose you are right. Forget I mentioned it." The conversation moved on and Catherine shot Donovan a quick, grateful glance. He did not look at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth turn up very slightly, and she knew he had done it on purpose, had redirected the conversation away from her. After supper, Mrs. Henshaw brought out a bottle of whiskey and poured small glasses for everyone, including Catherine. "One drink," she said, "to toast the holiday." Catherine had never been much for drinking, but she took the glass and held it while Mrs. Henshaw raised her own. "To another year survived," the older woman said, "and to better ones ahead." "To better ones ahead," the boarders echoed, and they all drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it left a warm glow in Catherine's stomach that was not entirely unpleasant. As the evening wore on and the boarders began drifting off to their rooms or the parlor, Catherine helped Mrs. Henshaw clear the table. She was carrying a stack of plates toward the kitchen when she passed Donovan in the hallway. He was standing by the window, looking out at the snow falling heavily in the darkness beyond. "Thank you," she said quietly, stopping a few feet away from him, "for what you did at supper, redirecting that conversation." He turned to look at her, surprise evident on his face. "You do not need to thank me for that." "Yes, I do. You have been very kind to me, very patient. I wanted you to know that I have noticed." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger. "You do not owe me anything for treating you with basic decency." "That should be the standard, not something worthy of thanks." "But it is not the standard," Catherine said, and there was an edge of bitterness in her voice she could not quite suppress. "Not in my experience." Donovan was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes searching her face. I am sorry for whatever happened to make you feel that way, and I am sorry that I cannot change it, but I want you to know that I will never do anything to make you feel unsafe. You have my word on that." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Because I had a sister once. She was 2 years younger than me, and she was the kindest person I ever knew. When I was 21 and she was 19, she married a man who seemed decent enough on the surface. But he was not decent, not behind closed doors. He hurt her. Often. And when she finally found the courage to leave him, when she ran away in the middle of the night and showed up at my door with bruises on her arms and terror in her eyes, I swore I would kill him if I ever saw him again." Catherine's breath caught. "What happened?" "I moved her out here, away from Kansas where he could not find her. Got her set up in a little house in Denver with enough money to live on for a while. She seemed to be doing better, seemed to be healing. But I guess the damage went deeper than I realized. One morning about a year after she left him, they found her in the river. The sheriff said it looked like she had walked in of her own accord." "Oh God," Catherine whispered. "I am so sorry." "Her name was Diana," Donovan said, his voice rough with old grief. "She was 20 years old when she died, and every time I see a woman who flinches when a man reaches for her, I think about her. I think about how maybe if more men had treated her with kindness and respect, if more men had given her space to heal instead of demanding things from her, maybe she would have found a reason to keep living. So that is why I care. That is why I will always care." Catherine felt tears burning in her eyes. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the pain she could hear in his voice, but she could not find the words. Instead, she did something she had not done in months. She took a step toward him instead of away. Donovan noticed immediately, his eyes widening slightly, but he did not move. He stood perfectly still, letting her come to him at her own pace. She stopped about 2 feet away, close enough to speak quietly without being overheard if anyone came into the hallway. "My husband beat me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "For 3 years. I stayed because I thought I had to, because I thought it was my fault, because he told me that no one would believe me if I told them. But one night he hurt me so badly that I knew if I stayed, he would eventually kill me. So I waited until he passed out drunk, and I took what little money I had hidden away and I ran. I have been running ever since. I changed my name. I lied about where I came from. I have been terrified every single day that he will find me and drag me back." Donovan's jaw tightened, and she saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. "He will not find you here," he said, his voice low and fierce. "And if he does, he will have to go through me to get to you. I promise you that." The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, made something inside her crack open. She had not realized how desperately she had needed someone to say those words, to promise her that she did not have to face her fears alone. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "I do not know how to stop being afraid," she whispered. "I do not know how to trust again." "You do not have to know how right now," Donovan said gently. "You just have to take it one day at a time. And you are already doing that. You are already so much braver than you think you are." They stood there in the hallway for a long moment, the house quiet around them, the snow falling steadily outside. Finally, Catherine took a shaky breath and wiped at her eyes. "I should finish helping Mrs. Henshaw," she said, "of course." Donovan stepped aside to let her pass, giving her plenty of room, but as she walked by him, he said softly, "Catherine." She stopped and looked back at him. It was the first time he had used her given name. "If you ever want to talk about anything at all, I am here. No pressure, no expectations. Just if you want to." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and continued to the kitchen. but something had shifted between them in that conversation, something fundamental. She had told him the truth about herself, had laid bare her greatest shame and her deepest fear, and he had not recoiled. He had not judged her. He had simply accepted what she had told him and promised to keep her safe. That night, for the first time since fleeing Kansas City, Catherine slept without nightmares. The days after Christmas passed in a kind of quiet peace that Catherine had not experienced in years. The work at the boarding house continued as it always had, but she found herself less on edge, less constantly vigilant. She still kept her distance from most of the boarders, but her fear had lost some of its sharp edges. And gradually, tentatively, she began to seek out Donovan's company. It started small. She might linger in the parlor for a few minutes in the evening when he was reading, sitting in a chair across the room with her own mending. They would not speak, would barely acknowledge each other, but there was a comfort in the shared silence. Then one evening he looked up from his book and said, "This is a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. Have you ever read any of his work?" "A little," Catherine said. "We had a book of his plays when I was young. I remember reading Romeo and Juliet and thinking it was the most romantic thing I had ever encountered." "And now?" Donovan asked. "Now I think they were both very young and very foolish, and that most of the tragedy could have been avoided with better communication and less impulsive decision-making." Donovan laughed, a real laugh that lit up his whole face. "That is a much more practical assessment, though not a very romantic one." "I suppose I am not a very romantic person anymore," Catherine said, and there was a wistfulness in her voice. "Or perhaps you are just waiting for a romance that is less tragic and more substantial," Donovan suggested. "Something built on trust and respect rather than passion and poor planning." Their eyes met across the room, and Catherine felt a flutter in her chest that she had thought was long dead. She looked away first, suddenly flustered, and made an excuse to return to the kitchen. But the conversation stayed with her, as did the warmth in Donovan's eyes when he had spoken of trust and respect. January brought brutally cold weather, with temperatures dropping so low that it hurt to breathe the air outside. The boarders came home every evening half frozen, stamping snow from their boots and crowding around the stove in the parlor. Donovan came down with a bad cold that left him feverish and coughing, and Mrs. Henshaw insisted he stay in bed for a few days to recover properly. Without thinking too hard about what she was doing or why, Catherine volunteered to bring his meals up to his room. Mrs. Henshaw gave her a long, considering look, but did not object. The first time Catherine knocked on Donovan's door, balancing a tray with soup and tea, she felt her old nervousness returning. But when he called for her to come in, she found him sitting up in bed fully dressed except for his boots, with a quilt wrapped around his shoulders and a book in his lap. He looked terrible, his face flushed with fever and his eyes red-rimmed, but he smiled when he saw her. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can come down to eat, Mrs. Henshaw says you are to stay in bed," Catherine said firmly, setting the tray on the small table beside him. "And I am inclined to agree with her. You look like you are about to fall over." "I feel like I am about to fall over," he admitted. "But I hate being a burden." "You are not a burden. You are sick. There is a difference." She poured him a cup of tea and handed it to him carefully, making sure their fingers did not touch. "Drink this. It has honey and lemon in it." He took the cup obediently and sipped at it while she arranged the soup bowl and spoon where he could easily reach them. She was acutely aware of being alone with him in his room, of the intimacy of the situation, but to her surprise, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else, something that might have been tender concern. "Thank you," Donovan said softly, "for taking care of me." You would do the same for me, Catherine said. I know you would. In a heartbeat, he agreed. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Catherine, would you stay for a few minutes? Just to talk. I have been staring at these four walls all day, and I think I am going a little crazy from the isolation. She hesitated, weighing her ingrained caution against the genuine loneliness she could hear in his voice. Finally, she pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it a safe distance from the bed, then sat down. What do you want to talk about? She asked. Anything. Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with being afraid or running away. Tell me something from before all of that. Catherine thought for a moment, reaching back into her past for memories that were not tainted by pain and fear. I had a garden once, she said slowly. When I was a girl, before everything fell apart, my mother taught me how to grow vegetables and herbs. I loved it. I loved putting seeds in the ground and watching them grow into something useful and beautiful. I have not had a garden in years, but I still remember exactly how it felt to dig my hands into the soil. What did you grow? Donovan asked, genuine interest in his voice. Tomatoes, beans, peas, carrots, herbs like basil and thyme, and flowers too, though my mother said flowers were frivolous. I did not care. I thought they were worth growing just for the beauty of them. She paused, surprised by how much she was saying. What about you? What did you do before you became a cowboy? I have always been a cowboy, Donovan said. Grew up on a ranch in Kansas, learned to ride before I could walk, according to my father. It is the only life I have ever known, and I cannot imagine doing anything else. There is something about working with animals and the land, about being outside under an open sky, that feels right to me. Like it is what I was meant to do. They talked for nearly an hour, about small things and big things, about the past and the present, and carefully avoided discussing the future. Catherine found herself relaxing in a way she had not relaxed in years, laughing at his stories about stubborn horses and ornery cattle, sharing her own memories of childhood adventures and misadventures. Finally, noticing that his eyes were drooping with exhaustion, she stood up. You need to rest. I will come back for the tray later. Will you bring me supper too? He asked, and stay to talk again, if you want me to. I do, he said simply. Very much. For the 3 days that Donovan was confined to his room, Catherine brought him every meal and stayed to talk. They discovered a dozen things they had in common. A love of reading, a preference for early mornings over late nights, a deep appreciation for the beauty of the Colorado mountains. They also discovered their differences. He loved the isolation of ranch work while she craved the bustle of a town. He was content with silence while she needed music and laughter. He was endlessly patient while she tended toward anxiety and overthinking. But the differences did not matter. What mattered was the ease of being together, the way conversation flowed naturally between them, the way Catherine found herself looking forward to those hours in his room with an eagerness that both surprised and worried her. On the third day, when Donovan was clearly feeling better and Mrs. Henshaw declared that he could rejoin the others for meals, Catherine felt an unexpected pang of loss. The intimacy of those private conversations had been precious, a safe space where she could practice being herself again, and she was not ready to give it up. That evening, as she was serving supper, Donovan caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips, and moved on to the next boarder. But later, when everyone had gone to the parlor or their rooms and she was finishing the dishes, she heard a soft knock on the kitchen door. Donovan stood there, hat in hand, looking uncertain. "I know you are probably tired," he said, "but I wondered if you would like to take a walk with me. Just a short one. The snow has stopped and the moon is out. It is beautiful." Every instinct Catherine had developed over the past year screamed at her to say no, to retreat to the safety of her room and lock the door. But a newer instinct, one that was just beginning to unfurl inside her, whispered that she would be safe with him, that he was offering her something precious, trust and companionship without demands or expectations. "All right," she heard herself say. "Let me get my cloak." They walked through the streets of Durango in the cold January night, keeping a careful distance between them, not touching. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath misted in the air. The town was quiet, most people sensibly inside by their fires, and it felt like they had the whole world to themselves. "I have been thinking about something," Donovan said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "And I hope you will not take this the wrong way, but I wanted to say it anyway." Catherine's heart sped up with familiar anxiety. "What is it?" "I care about you," he said, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I care about you in a way that goes beyond friendship or basic human decency. And I think maybe you might care about me too. But I want you to know that I am not going to push you for anything. I am not going to demand that you feel a certain way or act a certain way. I just wanted you to know the truth, so that you could decide what, if anything, you want to do with that information." Catherine stopped walking, and after a few steps, Donovan stopped too and turned to face her. The moonlight made his features look softer, younger, and his eyes were steady and honest. "I am terrified," she said, her voice trembling. "I am terrified of trusting someone again, of letting someone get close enough to hurt me, because I know what that pain feels like, and I do not think I could survive it again." "I know," Donovan said quietly. "And I am not asking you to stop being afraid. I am just asking you to consider the possibility that not everyone will hurt you. That some people, some men, are worthy of your trust. Not because I think I am special or perfect, but because I will spend every day proving to you that you made the right choice in giving me a chance." Tears were streaming down Catherine's face now, freezing on her cheeks. "What if I cannot do this? What if I try and I just cannot get past the fear?" "Then I will wait," Donovan said simply. "I will wait for as long as it takes, months, years, whatever you need, because you are worth waiting for." Something broke open inside her then, some last fragile wall that had been holding her together and keeping her separate from the world. She took a step toward him, and then another, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him. He did not move, did not reach for her, just stood perfectly still and let her come to him. Slowly, giving herself every opportunity to change her mind and pull back, Catherine raised her hand. She held it out in the space between them, palm up, an offering and a question. For a moment, Donovan just looked at her hand, and she could see the understanding dawn in his eyes. He knew what she was asking, knew what it meant for her to be the one initiating contact. He raised his own hand, just as slowly, and placed it gently against hers. His palm was warm despite the cold night air, his fingers long and calloused from years of ranch work. He did not grasp her hand or pull her closer, just rested his palm against hers, letting her feel the solid warmth of him. Catherine's breath caught at the contact. She waited for the panic to come, for the instinct to jerk away and run. But it did not come. Instead, what she felt was a tentative sense of safety, a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to trust this man's touch. "Is this all right?" Donovan asked softly. "Yes," Catherine whispered. "It is all right." They stood like that for a long moment, hands pressed together under the cold moon, not speaking. Then, very carefully, Donovan curled his fingers around hers, holding her hand properly. The gesture was gentle, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she needed to. But Catherine did not pull away. Instead, she curled her own fingers around his, holding on. "We should head back before we freeze," Donovan said eventually. But can I walk you home holding your hand?" "Yes," Catherine said, and the word felt like a victory. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and when they reached the front steps, Donovan released her fingers with obvious reluctance. "Good night, Catherine," he said. "Good night, Donovan." She went inside and up to her room, and when she closed the door behind her, she found herself smiling. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was real. Over the following weeks, Catherine and Donovan continued their careful courtship. They took walks in the evening when the weather allowed, always keeping a respectful distance, always letting Catherine set the pace. They sat together in the parlor, reading or talking quietly while Mrs. Henshaw pretended not to notice the growing affection between them. They held hands sometimes, that simple contact becoming easier and more natural with each repetition. Donovan never pushed for more. He never tried to kiss her, never suggested anything that might make her uncomfortable. He simply existed beside her, patient and steady, waiting for her to be ready for the next step. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures and the first hints that spring might eventually come. Donovan mentioned that he would be busy once the weather improved, that the spring roundup would require him to be away from Durango for weeks at a time. The thought of him being gone filled Catherine with an unexpected sadness. "I will miss you," she admitted one evening as they sat in the parlor. The admission felt huge, a vulnerability she would not have been able to voice even a month earlier. "I will miss you too," Donovan said, "but I will come back every chance I get, and I will write to you if you want me to." "I would like that." "Catherine," he said, setting down his book and turning to face her fully. "Before I go, there is something I need to ask you, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer because I need you to be sure." Her heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "When I come back from the spring roundup, when the work slows down for the summer, I would like to court you properly, with the intention of eventually asking you to marry me, if you will have me. I know it is too soon to make that kind of commitment now, and I am not asking you to. But I want you to know that that is where I hope this is heading, and I want to know if that is something you could see yourself wanting too." Catherine's mind reeled. Marriage. The very word made her stomach clench with old fear. She had been married before, and it had nearly destroyed her. The thought of putting herself in that position again, of giving a man legal authority over her life and her body, made her want to run as far and as fast as she could. But this was Donovan. Donovan, who had never once made her feel unsafe. Donovan, who had given her space and time and patience. Donovan, who had held her hand under the moonlight and promised to wait for as long as she needed. "I do not know if I can ever be a proper wife," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I do not know if I can ever be comfortable with all the things that marriage entails. With the physical aspects of it." Donovan reached over and took her hand, and she let him. "If you agreed to marry me," he said carefully, "it would be a partnership built on respect and affection. I would never force you to do anything you were not ready for. We would figure out the physical aspects together, at your pace, if and when you felt comfortable. And if that never happens, if that is never something you can be comfortable with, then we would find other ways to build a life together. Because I care about you, Catherine Monroe, not about what you can give me or do for me. I care about you for who you are, scars and fears and all." Tears were pouring down her face again, but they were different tears than the ones she had shed so many times before. These were tears of relief, of hope, of a gratitude so profound it hurt. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, that is something I could want with you." Donovan smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I will come back to you," he promised, "and we will figure out the rest together." He left for the spring roundup 2 weeks later, and Catherine felt his absence like a physical ache. But he kept his promise to write, and every week a letter arrived addressed to her in his neat, precise handwriting. He wrote about the work, about the cattle and the horses and the other cowboys. He wrote about the landscape, about the mountains still capped with snow and the valleys beginning to turn green. And he wrote about missing her, about counting the days until he could return to Durango. Catherine wrote back, tentative at first and then with growing confidence. She wrote about her work at the boarding house, about Mrs. Henshaw's gossip and the antics of the other boarders. She wrote about the books she was reading and the small signs of spring appearing in town. And she wrote, carefully at first and then with more openness, about her feelings for him, about how much she looked forward to his return. Spring turned to early summer, and Donovan returned to Durango in June, sun-bronzed and trail-worn but with eyes that lit up when he saw her. They resumed their careful courtship, but Catherine noticed a difference in herself. She was less afraid now, more willing to let him close. She let him put his arm around her shoulders as they walked. She let him hold her hand without that initial spike of panic. And one evening, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset, she let him kiss her cheek, a gentle brush of lips that made her heart race but not with fear. "Is this all right?" he asked, just as he always asked. "Yes," she said, and found that she meant it. By July, Donovan had formally asked Mrs. Henshaw for permission to court Catherine, a formality since everyone in the boarding house knew what was happening anyway. Mrs. Henshaw had given her grudging approval, along with a stern warning to Donovan that if he hurt Catherine, he would answer to her. Donovan had accepted the warning with good grace and a promise to always treat Catherine with the respect and care she deserved. One warm evening in late July, as they walked along the creek that ran through the edge of town, Donovan stopped and turned to face Catherine. "I know we said we would wait until after the summer to talk about the future," he said, "but I cannot wait any longer. I have to ask you now." Catherine's heart leaped into her throat, but it was excitement more than fear. "Ask me what?" Donovan dropped to one knee in the tall grass beside the creek, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Catherine Monroe, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are safe, that you are cherished, that you are loved beyond measure?" Catherine looked down at him, this man who had shown her such patience and kindness, who had never once made her feel less than worthy of love and respect. She thought about the long journey she had taken to get to this moment, the months of fear and running, the slow, painful process of learning to trust again. And she thought about the future that stretched out before them, full of possibility and hope. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you." Donovan stood and opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It was not extravagant, but it was beautiful, and when he slipped it onto her finger, it fit perfectly. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. A real kiss. Catherine's breath caught, but she nodded. Donovan cupped her face gently in his hands, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and then he kissed her. It was soft and sweet and careful, asking rather than taking, and Catherine felt something inside her finally, truly heal. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "When do you want to get married?" Donovan asked. "Soon," Catherine said. "I do not want to wait any more." They were married in early August in a small ceremony at the church in Durango, with Mrs. Henshaw standing as witness and crying openly throughout the proceedings. Catherine wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henshaw had helped her make, and Donovan wore his best suit. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Catherine felt a peace she had not known was possible. Donovan had rented a small house on the outskirts of town, close enough to his work at the Triple Creek Ranch that he could come home most evenings, but far enough from the center of Durango that they had privacy. He carried Catherine over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room. "Welcome home," he said softly. That night, Catherine's old fears tried to resurface as they prepared for bed. But Donovan, as always, was patient and understanding. "We do not have to do anything tonight," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed fully clothed. "We do not have to do anything until you are ready. This is your home now, and you should feel safe here always." "I want to try," Catherine said, her voice trembling but determined. "I want to try to be a real wife to you." "You are already a real wife to me," Donovan said firmly. "Sharing a bed is not what makes a marriage real. Trust and commitment and choosing each other every day, that is what makes a marriage real. Everything else is just a physical expression of feelings we already have." They lay down together that night, and Donovan held her carefully, his arms a protective circle that never felt like a cage. Catherine rested her head on his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in years, she felt completely safe. Over the following weeks and months, they learned each other's rhythms and patterns. They learned how to share space, how to navigate disagreements, how to build a life together. And slowly, carefully, Catherine learned to trust Donovan with her body as well as her heart. It took time, patience, and many conversations about boundaries and comfort, but gradually the physical aspects of their marriage became a source of connection rather than fear. That first winter in their little house was hard in some ways, the cold testing their supplies and their spirits, but it was also beautiful. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting together in comfortable silence. Donovan taught Catherine how to recognize different bird calls, and she taught him how to bake proper bread. They argued occasionally, as all couples do, but they learned how to argue fairly, how to express frustration without cruelty, how to apologize and forgive. In the spring of 1879, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror. She had not thought much about having children, too focused on simply surviving and healing, but now that it was happening, she found herself desperately wanting this baby while simultaneously fearing that she would not be a good mother. Donovan, as always, was her anchor. He held her while she cried out her fears, reassured her that she would be an excellent mother, and promised to be beside her every step of the way. When morning sickness made her miserable, he brought her tea and crackers and rubbed her back. When her fears became overwhelming, he reminded her of how strong she was, how far she had come. Their son was born in November of 1879, a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. They named him Thomas, after Donovan's father, and from the moment Catherine held him, she knew that she would do anything to protect this child, to make sure he grew up in a home filled with love and safety. Watching Donovan with Thomas was a revelation. He was gentle and patient, changing diapers and walking the floor with a crying baby at 2 in the morning without complaint. He sang lullabies in a low, rumbling voice that somehow always soothed Thomas when nothing else would. And he looked at both Catherine and their son with such evident love and pride that it made her heart ache with happiness. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Catherine found herself healing in ways she had not expected. Caring for her son, watching him explore the world with fearless curiosity, reminded her of who she had been before fear had taken root in her soul. She started a garden behind their house, teaching Thomas the names of plants and showing him how to be gentle with growing things. She made friends with other women in town, slowly building a community around herself. Donovan continued to work at the Triple Creek Ranch, but he made sure to be home as much as possible, never wanting to miss important moments with his family. He taught Thomas how to feed the chickens they kept, how to recognize animal tracks in the dirt, how to be kind to creatures smaller and weaker than himself. In the summer of 1881, Catherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. She had Donovan's sunny disposition and Catherine's determination, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny fingers from day one. Thomas, now a toddler of nearly 2, was initially uncertain about having to share his parents' attention, but he quickly became fiercely protective of his baby sister. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. The years passed, marked by small triumphs and minor setbacks, by children's laughter and quiet evenings on the porch. Catherine's garden flourished, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for the house. Donovan was promoted to foreman at the Triple Creek Ranch, a position that came with better pay and more responsibility, but also allowed him more flexibility with his time. In the spring of 1883, Catherine realized with surprise that she had not thought about her first husband in months. The man who had haunted her nightmares for so long had faded to a distant memory, no longer holding power over her present. She mentioned this to Donovan one evening after the children were asleep. "I think I have finally healed," she said, wonder in her voice. "I think I am finally free of him." Donovan pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You were always free of him," he said. "From the moment you walked away, you were free. You just needed time to believe it." "I could not have done it without you," Catherine said. "Without your patience and your kindness and your willingness to let me heal at my own pace." "We healed each other," Donovan said. "You helped me heal from losing Deanna. You showed me that her death was not in vain, that good men can make a difference by simply choosing to be decent and kind." "We saved each other, Catherine. That is what love does." In the autumn of 1884, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the previous 2, and in May of 1885 they welcomed another son, whom they named James. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn eyes, and he completed their family in a way that felt perfect. As their children grew, Catherine and Donovan made sure to teach them about kindness and respect, about the importance of treating others with dignity regardless of their station or circumstances. They taught Thomas to be strong but gentle, to use his strength to protect rather than intimidate. They taught Rose to be confident and brave, to speak up for herself and others. And they taught James, as he grew old enough to understand, to be thoughtful and considerate, to think before acting. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges but also deep contentment. The children started school, made friends, got into the usual childhood scrapes and adventures. The little house on the outskirts of Durango grew more comfortable with each year, filled with the accumulated treasures of a happy family. Children's drawings on the walls, books overflowing the shelves, a well-worn quilt that Catherine had made draped over the back of the sofa. In 1887, Mrs. Henshaw passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Catherine grieved the loss of the woman who had given her a chance when she was desperate and afraid. At the funeral, she held Donovan's hand and thought about how much had changed since that day in September of 1878 when she had first arrived in Durango, terrified and alone. "She would be proud of you," Donovan murmured. "Proud of the life you have built, the woman you have become." "I hope so," Catherine said. "I owe her so much." By 1890, Thomas was 10 years old, Rose was 9, and James was 5. They were a lively, loving family, and Catherine sometimes had to pinch herself to believe that this was her life, that this happiness was real and lasting. She had long since stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped fearing that her past would catch up with her. She was Catherine Drake now, wife and mother and member of the Durango community, and the frightened woman she had been felt like someone from another lifetime. One evening in late summer, with the children playing in the yard and supper cooking on the stove, Catherine stood at the window watching Donovan teach Thomas how to rope fence posts. Rose was attempting to do the same, her movements clumsy but determined, while James sat in the grass making elaborate structures with sticks. The scene was so perfectly, ordinarily beautiful that Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Donovan looked up and caught her watching. He grinned and she waved back, her heart so full it almost hurt. When he came inside a few minutes later, brushing dust off his clothes, she wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. "What was that for?" he asked, surprised but pleased. "For everything," Catherine said. "For being patient with me all those years ago. For giving me time to learn to trust you. For building this life with me. For being the kind of man I can respect and love and trust completely. For being a wonderful father and a wonderful husband. For everything." Donovan held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "You do not have to thank me for loving you," he said softly. "Loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done. You are my whole world, Catherine, you and our children. Everything I do, everything I am, it is all for you." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the warm kitchen while the children's laughter drifted through the open window. Then Rose burst through the door, demanding to know when supper would be ready, and the moment passed into the comfortable chaos of family life. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Catherine and Donovan sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was warm, carrying the scent of Catherine's roses and the distant smell of hay from the fields beyond town. "You ever regret it?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Tying yourself to someone as damaged as I was, spending all that time waiting for me to be ready for a normal life." Donovan turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Never," he said firmly. "Not once, not for a single moment. You were not damaged, Catherine. You were hurt, and there is a difference. And waiting for you was not a burden or a sacrifice. It was an honor. Every day I got to spend with you, watching you heal and grow stronger, watching you learn to trust again, those were the best days of my life. Even better than this." Catherine asked, gesturing to the house, to the life they had built. "This exists because of that," Donovan said. "Because you were brave enough to reach for my hand that night in the snow. Because you were strong enough to trust me even when everything in your past told you not to. You gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, Catherine. You gave me your trust and your love and these beautiful children and this life. How could I ever regret any of it?" Catherine leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat like that as the stars came out one by one, and Catherine thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, to this man, to this life. She thought about the woman she had been, flinching from every man's hand, terrified and alone. And she thought about the woman she was now, strong and loved and completely, utterly safe. "I love you," she said softly. "I do not think I say it enough, but I love you so much." "I know," Donovan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I love you too, always." The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of a happy life. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's quiet strength and his mother's compassion. He decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, having inherited his mother's love for nurturing living things. And Donovan supported his decision wholeheartedly, even though it meant Thomas would have to go away to school in Denver. Rose grew into a spirited young woman with strong opinions and an unwavering sense of justice. She talked about becoming a teacher, wanting to help children learn and grow, and Catherine could see so much of herself in her daughter's determination to make a difference in the world. James remained the quiet, thoughtful one, content to spend hours reading or working with his hands. He helped his mother in the garden and showed an aptitude for growing things that suggested he might become a farmer or a botanist someday. In 1895, when Catherine was 40 years old and Donovan was 44, they celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary. Their children, now 15, 14, and 10, had planned a surprise party with help from friends and neighbors. As Catherine looked around at the gathered crowd, at the life and the community she had built, she marveled at how far she had come from that terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Durango 17 years earlier. "What are you thinking about?" Donovan asked, coming to stand beside her. "About how lucky I am," Catherine said. "About how different my life could have been if you had not been exactly who you are." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Donovan said. "We chose this. Every day we chose each other in this life. That is not luck. That is love." As the party continued around them, with music and laughter and the warmth of community, Catherine reflected on the truth of his words. They had chosen this life, had built it carefully and deliberately with patience and trust and unwavering commitment to each other. And that choice, renewed every day for 17 years, had created something beautiful and lasting. The seasons continued their endless cycle, bringing changes both welcome and bittersweet. Thomas left for veterinary school in Denver in 1896, and Catherine cried on the day they saw him off on the train, even though she was proud of him for pursuing his dreams. Rose graduated from school and began teaching at the little schoolhouse in Durango, proving to be as natural and gifted at it as they had all expected. James continued to grow, shooting up in height until he was taller than his father, his hands becoming skilled at coaxing beauty from the earth. Donovan was promoted to ranch manager at the Triple Creek Ranch in 1898, a position that came with more responsibility and better pay, but also more time at home, which he valued more than any amount of money. He and Catherine had weathered 20 years of marriage now, and their love had only deepened with time, growing from that tentative beginning in the winter of 1878 to something solid and unshakable. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned with all its promise and possibility, Thomas returned from Denver with his degree and a young woman he wanted them to meet. Her name was Sarah, and she was a teacher he had met at school. Catherine liked her immediately, recognizing in her a kindness and strength that reminded her of her younger self. Thomas and Sarah were married that summer in a ceremony that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Watching her son take his vows, Catherine remembered her own wedding day, remembered the mixture of hope and fear she had felt. But Thomas had no fear, only joy, and she was grateful that he had been raised in a home where love was gentle and respect was paramount. Rose met a young lawyer named Patrick in 1901, and after a courtship that lasted a year, they too were married. Catherine watched her daughter become a wife and felt a fierce satisfaction knowing that Rose would never tolerate the kind of treatment Catherine had endured in her first marriage. Rose was strong and confident, secure in her worth, and that was exactly what Catherine had wanted for her. James showed no interest in courting, preferring to focus on his work developing new strains of drought-resistant crops. He had turned their modest garden into something of an experimental farm, and local ranchers were starting to take notice of his innovations. Catherine was proud of all her children, of the good people they had become. In 1903, Thomas and Sarah presented Catherine and Donovan with their first grandchild, a healthy baby girl named Deanna, after Donovan's sister. Donovan cried when he held her for the first time, and Catherine knew he was thinking about the sister he had lost so many years ago. the sister whose death had led him to show such patience and kindness to a frightened woman in a boarding house. She would have loved this, Catherine said softly, standing beside Donovan as he cradled the tiny Diana in his arms. She would have been so happy to see you with a family of your own. I think she would have loved you, Donovan said, his voice thick with emotion. I think you two would have been great friends. I wish I could have met her, Catherine said. I wish I could thank her. Thank her for what? For having a brother who loved her enough to make sure no other woman suffered the way she did. For having a brother who understood that patience and kindness are worth more than anything else. She shaped you, Donovan, and in shaping you she saved me. Rose and Patrick had their first child in 1904, a son they named Robert. James finally met a woman who captured his interest in 1905, a botanist named Elizabeth who had come to Durango to study the native plants of the region. They bonded over their shared love of growing things, and Catherine knew without being told that James had found his match. As Catherine entered her 50s and Donovan his late 50s, they found themselves with more time to themselves as the children built their own lives. The little house felt bigger with just the two of them, but it was a comfortable emptiness, filled with memories and love. They took up traveling, visiting Thomas and Sarah in Denver, Rose and Patrick in Colorado Springs where they had moved for Patrick's work, James and Elizabeth, who had settled on a small farm outside Durango. They delighted in their grandchildren, watching the next generation grow and thrive. In 1910, on a warm summer evening much like the one when Donovan had first proposed, they sat on their porch and looked back on 32 years of marriage. "You remember the first time you spoke to me?" Catherine asked. "Really spoke to me, not just the polite greetings at meals." "Of course I do," Donovan said. "It was after that incident with Garrett when you ran out of the dining room. I wanted to follow you so badly to make sure you were all right, but I knew you needed space. I remember lying in bed that night thinking about you, about what could have happened to make you so afraid, and I remember deciding that I was going to do everything in my power to help you feel safe." "And you did," Catherine said. "You kept your distance until I was ready to reach for you. You gave me the time and space I needed to heal. You never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel like my fear was a burden or an inconvenience." "Your fear was valid," Donovan said. "You had been hurt terribly. Of course you were afraid. And I could not imagine demanding that you get over it on my timeline just because it would be more convenient for me. That would have made me just as bad as the man who hurt you in the first place." "You are nothing like him," Catherine said fiercely. "You have never been anything like him. You are good and kind and patient, and you gave me back my life." "We gave each other our lives," Donovan corrected. "That is what love is, Catherine. It is two broken people helping each other heal. It is patience and trust and choosing each other every single day even when it is hard. It is knowing that you are safe to be yourself, flaws and fears and all, and that you will be loved anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Catherine thought about the long road that had brought them to this moment, the years of fear and pain that had preceded their meeting, and the years of healing and love that had followed. "I never thought I would be happy again," she said softly. "When I was running from my first husband, when I was so afraid that I could barely function, I never imagined that I could have this. A good man who loves me, children who are happy and healthy, grandchildren, a community, a home. I thought that part of my life was over before it really began." "I am so glad you were wrong," Donovan said, taking her hand. "I am so glad you kept going, kept surviving, kept putting one foot in front of the other until you got to Durango, until you got to me. "I am glad I reached for your hand that night in the snow," Catherine said. "I was so scared, but I did it anyway, and it changed everything." "It did," Donovan agreed. "It changed both our lives. You gave me a reason to keep going after Diana died. You gave me a purpose, a family, a future. You gave me everything, Catherine." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine leaned against her husband, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. She thought about the woman she had been, flinching from every man's hand, and the woman she had become, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and safe and valued. The journey between those two women had been long and painful, but it had been worth every step. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day 32 years earlier. "I will always love you." "And I will always love you," Donovan replied, his voice full of warmth and certainty. "Always and forever, Catherine, until my last breath." They sat together on the porch as the night deepened around them, two people who had found each other in the midst of pain and fear and had built something beautiful together. They had proven that love did not have to be violent or possessive or frightening. They had proven that patience and kindness and respect could create something lasting and true. And as Catherine looked up at the stars, the same stars that had witnessed her fear and her healing, her first tentative steps toward trust and all the days that had followed, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had survived. She had healed. She had loved and been loved in return. She had built a life worth living, full of joy and purpose and connection. The cowboy who had kept his distance until she reached for his hand had become her husband, her partner, her home. And together, they had created a love story that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of patience and the possibility of healing, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could mend given enough time and care. As they finally rose to go inside, Donovan held the door open for her, and Catherine walked through into the warmth and light of their home, grateful beyond measure for every moment of the life they had built together. Behind them, the stars continued their eternal dance across the Colorado sky, bearing silent witness to a love that had been born in fear and grown into something extraordinary, a love that had healed two broken souls and made them whole again. Their story was not one of instant attraction or passionate declarations. It was quieter than that, more patient, built on a foundation of respect and trust that had taken years to establish. But it was real, and it was lasting, and it was proof that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that begin with a single, tentative touch, a frightened woman reaching out her hand, and a good man waiting patiently to hold it.